Cool. All right. The doors close?
It'll close if you want to.
The provocative statement. Maybe just ask the people who are outside to... maybe that's me being an asshole, sorry.
That's true, it's a little loud.
Okay. Alright, so hi, my name is Nick Ford. For around a year now, I've been running a site called abolishwork.com. In that time, I've been reading, analyzing, researching, discussing, and overall, bit by bit, immersing myself in sort of the anti-work literature. And I find the subject of work very important to anyone of any ideology because of the basic fact that work takes up most of our lives. Some would say all of our lives, depending on your definitions. Our lives, usually when we engage in casual conversations, are defined by what we're doing, not what we want, what we desire, or where we came from, or where we are. Our lives are sometimes only discussed in what's going on now, and whatever else we want is inconsequential to the real world. You'll hear this a lot. You know, the real world is this or that, or, you know, it just doesn't work like that, basically. No pun intended. And obviously, maybe the real world doesn't care about our dreams and wants us instead to be deprived of our goals, to have to work 9 to 5s, work in cubicles under bosses for pitiful wages, and in sorry conditions where our bargaining power is next to nothing, at least relative to them. But if this is the case, if this is what the real world is, then I say so much the worse for the real world, because that means that it needs replacing. I took a particular interest in work originally because an anarchist comrade of mine named David S. D'Amato had bought a domain name called abolishwork.com on a whim because he liked the idea behind it. He asked around an email list that we were both mutually on whether anyone was interested in it, and so after a long sort of finagling of myself about whether I'd want to take this job of investing all this energy and putting all this effort into this one project, I decided to go for it. So he originally wanted it to combine resources that are already existing or that were completely original from across the anarchist spectrum, egoist, communist, individualist, and whatever, on the idea of work abolitionism. And so in January of 2014, I wrote my first post introducing the site as aiming to be a sort of home for work and its discontents, a place where you can find essays, blogs, observations, songs, poems, and whatever else you can imagine about ending or at the very least reducing the amount of work that exists in society. We welcome everyone from the hardened abolitionists to the reformers and the ones in between. So ideologically, abolishwork.com is pretty open. You'll see reposts, republishing of work by Andrea Gores, who's a post-Marxist. We also have The Right to be Lazy by Paul Lafargue. Also have the post-left anarchist Bob Black, The Abolition of Work, and a few other posts, essay by him. So we have a lot of very eclectic sort of opinions about how work should be looked at. It's not just all anarchists. Let's see. So if you would like to contribute something to Abolish Work, it makes my life a lot easier because basically it's just me, a few other people who sometimes, occasionally post or contribute to the site in some sense. But thankfully it's not work to me, so I enjoy doing these posts and talking about work. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. So part of my interest in work, or abolishing it, comes from the definition wars that can be fought over what it means. I know semantics isn't everyone's favorite thing, and it certainly isn't mine. But more of what I mean is to say that it's interesting to me that so many people view work in such a different light. The fact that so many people see anarchism, capitalism, socialism as worthy of discussion, analysis, and debate makes a lot of sense to me. These are very abstract ideas. You can categorize them very differently. They rely on a lot of sort of prefigurative value judgments. But to me, work is a lot more tangible. It's a lot more sort of involved in our life, regardless of whatever system we're under. So I'm amazed to sort of the extent that we can view work as inevitable and take it for granted instead of challenge it and talk about it and view it as something particularly objectionable, especially since it takes up most of our lives. So whatever you want to say about a given ideology, it's hard to argue that work isn't going to be a big factor in how that system plays itself out. So there are a lot of definitions of work, obviously. This is going to be a very non-exhaustive list of definitions. There's one definition in particular that I want to talk about that I'm sort of not, when I say I'm anti-work, I'm not talking about it. So Oscar Wilde the anarcho-socialist, talks about in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, that work is just basically activity of any kind. So if that's what you mean when you say that you're talking about work, then I'm not really against that. I mean, I'm doing something right now. It'd be pretty much a logical impossibility for me to be against work in that sense. I don't want people to be... Hey, Ben, how's it going? I don't want people to be useless automatons who never do anything, and I'm not advocating pure idleness, although I do think idleness is underrated. I think, so there's a more reasonable, sort of less overly inclusive definition of work that has been given by John Danaher. I'm maybe mispronouncing that. I asked him on Twitter how he pronounces his name, but he didn't get back to me, so I don't know how to pronounce it. So it's his fault, obviously. So he has this blog called Philosophical Disquisitions, and I actually recently ran into it, and he has this post called Should We Abolish Work? So very convenient. He says, work is the performance of some scale, cognitive, emotional, physical, etc., in return for economic reward, or in the ultimate hope of receiving some such reward. Danaher explains that this definition remains broad because it includes paid and unpaid labor, so it includes internships and traditional wage labor, but not overly inclusive because, say, Bertrand Russell in his In Praise of Idleness basically defines work by moving matter, he says it very abstractly. So Danaher's definition doesn't suggest that anything is work. It only suggests that what is work should be activities that include putting energy towards some economic reward. So although unpaid labor doesn't have a monetary benefit in mind immediately, in the long term, that's what people are after. Now, Danaher thinks he's captured sort of, quote, the core phenomena of interest in the anti-work literature, but I'm not exactly convinced. One of my personal favorite shorthand definitions that I'm actually using the more full quote of, by the post-left anarchist Bob Black in his The Abolition of Work. He says that my definition of work is forced labor, that is compulsory production. Both elements are essential. Work is production enforced by economic or political means, by the carrot or the stick. The carrot is just the stick by other means. But not all creation is work. Work is never done for its own sake. It's done on some account of some product or of some or output that the worker, or more often somebody else, say government or the boss, gets out of it. This is what work necessarily is. To define it is to hate it. So I suspect Danaher would claim that this definition is a little too value-laden to be useful because it inherently positions work as something that is irredeemably bad and inherently needs to be abolished. And I think Danaher is right that it's a very value-laden definition. And I think he's also correct that it puts a bigger burden on the anti-work advocate in terms of argumentation and evidence that work is an evil thing. But I think that's actually precisely why it's beneficial, because I think Danaher's definition of work seems to ignore the political, economic, and cultural complexities of work and factors that go into sort of the production that people do for certain ends. So, for instance, when people do certain things for an economic reward, what are they doing it for? Are they doing it just for those ends, or are they doing it for themselves? I don't think Danaher's definition has much commentary on this, as opposed to Bob Black's definition. What if they actually want to do something else, but are working because there aren't many choices? So yeah, Danaher's definition is definitely less value-laden, but I think actually that's one of its biggest weaknesses. So if we were working for simply the economic goal and nothing else, this is something that the post-Marxist Andrei Gorz says in his, insert very long title, Critique of Economic Reason, Summary for Trade Unionists and Other Left Activists, that we are engaging in work for economic ends. It's work done only with those economic rewards in mind, and not actually done because you value the act intrinsically. The happiness or self-satisfaction that you get from work is secondary to the economic rewards that you get from it. So think of your typical retail job or minimum wage job that you have to do to survive. And that's usually what Gorz is discussing here. Gorz also discusses other types of work that I think helps us sort of broaden our discussion. And I do think Danaher is right that his definition sort of cuts to the core of the dispute in a way, but I don't think he's the only one doing it nor the best at it. So let's look at Gorz's other definitions of work. So I think Gorz is smart to not just accept work as just one thing, instead splits it up into different kinds of work. Because of course, stripped of any context, I have no real issue with someone working towards an economic return. The real question is who could? If all the anti-work position is saying is that attempting to achieve some economic reward should be eliminated from the range of options, then I think it's inane at best and dangerous at worst. Instead, I think the anti-work position largely takes issue with work for economic ends and extends this criticism to domestic labor and work for oneself, which Gores defines as still working towards economic ends, at least to some extent. But with domestic labor and work for oneself, there's still sort of a genuine self-interest that comes into it. These sort of examples of this sort of activity would be things like taking out the trash or doing the dishes or something like that. Obviously, these things aren't inherently objectionable, but they seem sort of de facto questionable if they're not necessary, and especially in some cases where you have sort of the traditional nuclear family where the woman or what have you is charged with much more labor than anyone else. So overall, I'm not really interested in abolishing work for oneself or domestic labor, but I do think it should be sort of reduced and reformed, making it more equitably shared. So the collective houses sometimes rotate duties about who has to wash the dishes or take out the trash or something. I think that's something that can help reduce work and make it more equitable for everyone. So that's something I think that should be more sort of regularly accepted in society. The last type of work that Gores considers is called autonomous activity, which is a form of action wherein you produce a good for some reward, but do so freely. In other words, you do it both because you want to and not out of some sort of economic or necessity of any sort, but out of a genuine desire for the thing in and of itself. So Gores wraps up our discussion on how to define work and why making our definitions non-value laden is problematic. He says that all these activities require work in the sense that they require effort and methodical application. But their meaning lies as much in their performance as in their product. Activities such as these are the substance of life itself. But this always requires there to be no shortage of time. Indeed, the same activity, bringing up children, preparing a meal, or taking care of our surroundings, for example, can take the form of a chore in which one is subject to what seems like oppressive constraints or of gratifying activities, depending on whether one is harassed by lack of time or whether the activity can be performed at leisure, in cooperation with others, and through the voluntary sharing of the tasks involved. So sometimes, most people don't look forward to doing the dishes, and I don't either. But I can take a real sort of joy in organizing things or categorizing things. So for me, that's not work because I get a sort of intrinsic joy out of organizing and categorizing things. One of the many benefits of having some sort of slight OCD, I guess. So what does it mean to be anti-work? Here's the definition of work that I think we can take away from this discussion, this sort of definitional dispute. Work is the constrained performance of some skill, cognitive, emotional, physical, etc., in return for substituting your own ends with an economic reward or in the ultimate hope of receiving some such reward. So I've tweaked Donaher's definition a little bit and put some more value-laden terms in there because I think that better reflects the reality of work. So I'm not trying to, or working to rid the world of effort or trying to stop scientists from spending 40 hours in their lab over the weekend. I don't think the anti-work position is fueled by telling people who are having a good time that they aren't. This is a popular thing to do, especially when you're opposing the system, and especially when you're coming from, for example, a Marxist perspective. The Marxists will claim sometimes that mystification and other phenomenon explain why workers act outside their interests, or why the state and the capitalists sometimes don't get along. But this conflict of interest between parties and themselves or other groups that have similar interests is nothing new, or a particularly radical thing to witness within the realm of history. And telling people that they simply don't believe what they say are in their interest probably isn't going to be the best way to counter this phenomenon. I had a discussion with someone once where I was talking about sort of just whatever, my personal views on something. And they were like, oh, he doesn't really believe that. He's just saying it because, I don't know, because apparently I don't believe the things I say. So eventually it just becomes hard to engage in a discussion when people are sort of sweeping the floor right out of you and saying, oh, no, you don't actually believe that. You're just fooling yourself. Which isn't to say that the Marxist notion of false consciousness has no weight to it. That's not what I'm arguing. There are certainly times that we fool ourselves into believing something, and there are psychological theories and concepts that talk about people sort of tricking themselves into liking things. People have false memories and stuff like that. And, they keep doing it either out of social pressure, cultural obligation, or some sense of moral duty, the implied threat of force, or the actual use of force. So there are plenty of things to make people falsely believe things. I just don't think that this line of intrigue is what anti-work is about. Because to convince people that work, as I've just defined it, needs to be abolished, I think that we need to do much more than tell them that they have a false idea of what good is and what bad is. We need to show them that there are better alternatives to work. This, to me, seems to be the better way to bring about a more sort of leisurely society that is more open to flexibility and social mobility. It'd actually be quite similar to the society that Karl Marx discusses in the German ideology, that will be able to, quote, do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So we're not defined in a relation to our roles. We're just, we're above them. We're an individual. We're unique. Egoism, blah, blah, blah. But this is getting ahead of myself a little bit. So let's say something about how the goal, how do we intend to get there? This sounds very lovely and magical, but how are we actually going to do this? So I'm certainly sympathetic to things like cooperatives, collectives, socializing the means of production, and access to capital more widely and perhaps as widely as possible. But I don't think that this in of itself solves the problem. You can have the worker cooperatives in Argentina, for instance, where the workers work their normal shift and then need to go to a 4-hour meeting before they can spend some time to themselves or with their families. I think in a scenario like that, work is still operating in a sort of different context, but still a fairly problematic one. So it's just to say, basically, that we shouldn't see democratizing of the economy as some sort of golden key to our problems with work. I think cooperatives and collectives can still have their problems with work, even if they're sharing it. There can still be cultural issues, inner social dynamics that are problematic. So meetings can be, I know this is very surprising for some leftists, but meetings can be a very oppressive environment where social conformity can be expected instead of deemed irrelevant or damaging to strong cooperative social dynamics. And even without the sort of danger of groupthink, and I'm using the psychological term, not the conservative buzzword, these sort of hours that people use for meetings could still make an otherwise pleasant structure of work. Everyone's fine with their 4-hour workday, but isn't so much fine with the 5 hours of meetings afterwards, which might make the whole thing monotonous and restrictive of people's times and needs. And of course, people can innovate. I'm not saying that this is some sort of inherent problem. I'm just saying it's a possibility. As I mentioned before, I think you can have a collective house where duties are rotated, roles are shifted randomly, and person to person, and this not only makes work easier, but also specialization less rampant and diversification more possible. Because, as Robert Heinlein said, specialization is for insects. So sure, democratization of the economy, education, building alternatives, these are all very good things. But these are all long-term projects, obviously. So what are we going to do for people now? Sure. So we could hide in our collectives and cooperatives or our ivory tower intellectual groups and do nothing material about it. But there's probably better things that we can do. So one thing that I think we can do is instill a culture of solidarity, mutual aid in our local communities. For those who have the time, energy, and people skills, aka not me, it may be a good idea to start up organizations around, for example, supporting the homeless, especially when increasingly the state keeps criminalizing the act of trying to feed the homeless, which is something like great organizations like Food Not Bombs try to do anyway. Things like the Boston Solidarity Network, or the more popularly the Seattle Solidarity Network, are great ideas for building connections between people who are having similar struggles with work or rent or what have you. And in general, creating affinity groups. Hint, hint, there's a talk that I wanted to go to, but they scheduled at the same time as mine, so I'm here instead. That are made up of sort of other anti-work people or sympathetic people could be a much better way of dealing with things than yelling things like jobs, not jails, especially when a lot of people actually feel like their jobs are a form of prison. Not to say that it's somehow virtuous to abstain from working, leech off friends, or that if you're dying on the streets that being in jail would be better than a job or whatever. Obviously, the prison system is far worse than the way jobs operate on average, but that doesn't mean that jobs are the solution, which is mostly what I'm sort of objecting to here with that slogan, especially when so much sort of sexual harassment, exploitation of power differentials, injuries, and even death can happen in the workplace. Minimalism is another possible short-term goal for individuals, perhaps even more strongly for collectives, sharing costs and stuff like that, reducing, not for everybody obviously, but reducing focusing on your needs and minimizing how much you need to spend can help you access unconventional forms of employment that might make you not as much, but you might not need as much. And you can also help encourage other people to get involved in this. Obviously, again, this is a lifestyle choice. Not everyone's going to be into that sort of lifestyle, and that's totally fine. So the end goal being there, sort of something like a future where we're all looking very weirdly at anyone who is in some sort of corporate job. So another form of anti-work activism may be just highlighting how much damage work does. For example, disinformation.com back in 2010 gives some alarming statistics on just how common global injuries and deaths related to work were as of 2002. It's a little bit old, but I have some more updated statistics as well. The International Labor Organization, or ILO, estimates that approximately 2 million workers lose their lives annually due to occupational injuries and illnesses, with accidents causing at least 350,000 deaths a year. For every fatal accident, there are estimated 1,000 non-fatal injuries, many of which result in lost earnings, permanent disability, and poverty. The death toll at work, much of which is attributable to unsafe working practices, is the equivalent of 5,000 workers dying each day, 3 persons every minute. This is more than double the figure for deaths from warfare, 650,000 deaths per year. According to the ILO's Safe Work Program, work kills more people than alcohol and drugs together, and the resulting loss in gross domestic product is 20 times greater than all official development assistance to the developing countries. So this is pretty big statistics, obviously. I tried to find more recent statistics. It was a little challenging because there's surprisingly, maybe unsurprisingly, not a lot of statistics about how many people are killed globally. There are some national statistics, but I didn't really want to focus on that, meaning the U.S. But since then, this is the latest thing I could find in my short amount of time looking for it, was the Journal of Safety Research summarized in 2009 that the total number of occupational accidents and fatal work-related diseases has increased, but the fatality rates per 100,000 workers have decreased, which is good and bad, obviously. There were almost 360,000 fatal occupational accidents in 2003, and almost 2 million fatal work-related disease in 2002. Every day, more than 960,000 workers get hurt because of accidents. Each day, 5,330 people die because of work-related diseases. Okay, that's enough numbers. Way too many numbers. So on that note, it's worth discussing. I'm going to try to tie this into anarchism a little bit, given the location and all. That our anarchism comes into play alongside the anti-work position, where we point out that state-controlled regulations like OSHA just aren't going to cut it. If we're looking for real protection of workers, then building work solidarity through wildcat non-state unions is much more important. IWW being an obvious example. There's one in Florida that's very good too, and I never remember its name. But either way, if you're not fundamentally improving work as a sort of system, then you can smash all the gears that you want, but it's not actually going to change anything. So what are we working towards? What sort of world could we expect to create through anti-work advocacy and a consistent approach to work as it stands? I believe that world would be largely populated with what Gores calls autonomous activity, with people doing things because they wanted it and not doing, as the anthropologist David Graeber terms it, bullshit jobs. Bullshit jobs, by the way, are the jobs that are superfluous and could be easily automated and are largely inconsequential to a functioning and healthy society. Instead, our time would be taken up by what Bob Black termed in his essay Smokestack Lightning, productive play, which I think is a wonderful term. Bob Black says, "My proposal is to combine the best part, in fact the only good part of work, the production of use values, with the best of play," which I take to be every aspect of play. It's freedom and it's fun, it's voluntariness and its intrinsic gratification, shorn of the Calvinist connotations of frivolity and self-indulgence, which the masters of work, echoed by the likes of Johann, I'm going to butcher this last name, sorry, Huizinga, and David Ramsay Steele have labored to attach to free play. Activities which are, for the time and circumstances and the individuals engaged in them, intrinsically gratifying play, yet which in their totality produce the means of life for all. The most necessary functions, such as those of the primary sector, like food production, already have their looted counterparts in hunting and gardening, and hobbies. So the problem, basically, with work is that by definition it's almost never done for its own sake. Play is almost always done for its own sake with the user's self-interest in mind. It doesn't have to do with the capitalist intent or the government's need for more jobs or more work. Play just has to do with the participants and what they want to do and how they want to do it. If you don't want to play, then you simply don't. Most of us don't have such a choice when we engage in work. This is largely because of limited access to capital, credit, land, and ideas. The monopolies on land, money, and intellectual endeavors are created through things like eminent domain, outlawing alternative currencies, and intellectual property. All of this ratchets up the cost of competing with the already ingrained privileged elite. And while the smashing the state may be a lot of effort, obviously, I believe it will lead to a world where that sort of effort won't be needed anymore, at least if it's done right. I'm sure there will still be struggles and oppressions to be fought after the state and capitalism, things like patriarchy, heteronormativity, blah, blah, blah. But ideally, we'll have incentive structures, affinity groups, and cultural norms that will consistently challenge, uproot, and abolish, if necessary, things that give rise to non-anarchic dynamics, which has the effect, in totality, of making life a lot less burdensome for the least advantaged and having interest tending towards zero. By the way, does anyone know how long this runs? I'm a little...
5:45.
5:45? Okay, great. We're doing great on time. Having interest tending towards zero, credit being much more freely accessible, wealth disparities being largely ended or cut down to size, I think the economics of work will be completely changed. It'll be a lot more easier to do things with your neighbors, with your friends, etc., etc. There won't be burdensome government regulations or a culture that reinforces ideas that workers can't do it on their own, or that somehow we need bosses and politicians to order our lives. We'll know that we don't need licenses to braid hair, or the boss's permission to organize in a union, or a politician to organize our community in responses to situations we find problematic. The world we are looking at is one that isn't going to have us under constant surveillance or subjected to the type of subordination that makes us feel like if we're children. And speaking of which, the whole notion that children's playtime activities are unrealistic or irrelevant to their future should probably be reconsidered too. Teaching children to play is widely regarded as a very important part in their development and helping them reach their fullest cognitive potential. But why do we give that up when we get older? Why do we stop playing? Not all of us do, of course. Many of us still do board games, video games, etc., etc. But a lot of these playful situations that we have, including ones that beckon our intelligence and creativity, are highly confined, they're sterilized, or restricted by too many rules and side constraints. The benefits of being a child is that you don't even think about these restrictions, you can't even conceive of them. And if you can then if you can conceive of them, if you can think about them, you find the best way to route around them so that you don't have to deal with them in any sort of big way. Which doesn't mean that when we engage in a productive play that we should just pretend that the world around ourselves doesn't exist. We should still respect and abide by the rules and ideas that make up reality. And play has its consequences too. Play can be fun but challenging and have rewards that come from the play itself. But we can also love playing not because of the rewards, but because of the process. And hell, why not both? Ideally, we'll be enjoying both the process and the end result. And that's what productive play is all about. Replacing a lot of the sort of current work schemes with productive play, leisure, or nothing at all if it's just another bullshit job. So another controversial question is about the role of technology in a less work-filled world. Technological unemployment is sort of a part of this discussion and a phenomenon that I overall find to be a benefit and something and technology in general I think would have its place in a free society. But it's obviously not a clear-cut benefit. I wouldn't claim that people who become unemployed through technology are always going to find other jobs, or that somehow AI isn't, just going to pull a Terminator. We're all going to be subjugated to the technology. I don't know. I don't study AI, so I can't really comment there. But I do know that I'm all in favor of less bullshit jobs and, in general, more technological unemployment. Because at least in the, certainly in the short term, it's going to hurt people. That's bad. It should be mitigated as much as possible. But in the long run, if we're pushing more towards this sort of workless society, then I think we're going to be able to harness these technological developments for the better. We're going to be able to sort of move these people who have been displaced and put them in other sectors that they'd rather be in anyway. But an important part of harnessing that is making sure this technology remains open, democratic, and free as possible to use for anyone. Not having capitalist governments or upper-class yuppies from the tech bubble hold some sort of intellectual stranglehold on it via patents and copyrights. So wrapping up now in the conclusion, with my definitions, obviously this is very non-exhaustive. I'm not trying to close the conversation on work so much as open it up to anarchists and non-anarchists alike and challenge our preconceptions of what it means to work and what it means to be against and for. I don't mean to suggest that anyone who supports work still is necessarily supporting what I'm talking about. We could still be talking past each other. Some people mean work when all they mean is give effort. That's what Oscar Wilde was talking about. And some people are just talking about yard work. Other people are talking about the 9-to-5 situation, and still others are speaking more broadly about capitalism, corporations, wage labor, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of definitions to wrestle with and figure out what works best for the society we live in, and I don't really claim that mine is the best definition we can do. There are certainly others, but I just, I didn't want to pull a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and list 15 definitions and 20 different people who argued over it. there's actually like a page for the term exploitation, and it literally has like 20 definitions of the term, and like 40 people who have talked about it, and it's ridiculous. It's also very informative. So obviously my definition is very non-exhaustive. I just searched through a handful of definitions, and so there are other people I'd recommend. There's Claire Wolfe in her piece "Dark Satanic Cubicles: Smash the Job Culture," and if you want, talk to me afterwards. I can recommend to you lots of things about work. Or the classic by Paul Lafargue, "The Right to Be Lazy." I actually have a chapter-by-chapter review of that on my site, abolishwork.com. I meant to bring the handouts, but I forgot. But if you want to go to the Alliance of Libertarian Left's table is right near, literally like pretty much right next to the information desk. So I have handouts right there if you want them. So I want to, and then abolishwork.com has sort of a recommended section, which I've been very inconsistent in updating, but it still has good recommendations anyway. So I want to close this presentation by after doing a little bit more, but asking what is work good for? We can see it's good for getting things done, like Bob Black says it's good for one thing at least, which is the use values. But isn't work more than that? It has to do with what we get out of it, sure, but it also matters what conditions are involved in us choosing to get those things done to begin with. What forces contribute to us deciding we want to get A done, and that A is worth X amount of energy and worth the B reward? And where does that reward come from? These conditions and other cultural, economic, and political factors matter a great deal when we talk about work, which is why I don't want to stress non-value-laden definitions. So if we want to talk about work in the right way, then we're going to have to challenge certain cultural norms, like the Puritan work ethic, for example, work for its own sake. Don't even care about the reward. It doesn't even matter. Just work because God's going to save you because you're a hard worker. We're going to need to challenge the economic factors of work, like the concentration of wealth into the hands of privileged elites. And finally, we're going to have to challenge the political elements, and that means challenging the state at every turn so we can claim autonomy for ourselves. So let's go back to Danaher's essay, Should We Abolish Work? Because I certainly have my disagreements with it, but it's definitely an interesting and informative, well-written essay. So Danaher talks about two different kinds of arguments for the abolition of work. He mentions the work is bad argument and the opportunity cost argument. So I just want to go over both and wrap up. So the work is bad argument says that because work is bad and bad things should be abolished, that work should be abolished. Now, I'm not really convinced that most work abolitionists believe that bad things should always be abolished and never just reformed, but let's accept this for the sake of argument. Because anyway, more charitably, Danaher revised it to say, if something is intrinsically and overwhelmingly bad, then it should be abolished, which makes a lot more sense to me. And I agree with him that it seemed to fall more in line with the anti-work literature in general. But Danaher has some problems with this argument. So he says, quote, "It is not true that all workers are coerced into work. Some people are independently wealthy and have no need for the economic rewards that work brings. And some countries have sufficiently generous welfare provisions to take work out of the coercion bracket. As noted previously, the basic income guarantee could be a game changer in this regard." The whole thing about basic income, some anti-work people are for it. I'm not one of those people, but anyway. Similarly, while it is true that some forms of work are humiliating, stultifying, degrading, tiring, and deleterious to one's health and well-being, this isn't true of all forms of work. That's not to say we should do nothing about the forms of work that share these negative qualities, but it is to say that the complete abolition or diminution of work goes too far. Isn't that a great word? We should just focus on the bad forms of work, which of course requires a revised argument. So to respond to this a little bit, it's true that not all people are coerced into work. Then again, we could also denote that the people who largely aren't coerced into work are usually doing the coercing themselves, bosses, management, etc., or greatly benefiting from the coercing, capitalists, CEOs, investors, the government, whatever, to the point that they either can be said to be complicit or at the very least reliant on a coercive system. So regardless of whether not all workers are coerced or not, doesn't matter much if it means a lot of workers are poor or tend to be coerced to a greater extent than people who have options. This then may boil down to an interesting epistemological question, and I don't have data one way or the other, but I don't think the reply of not all workers goes very far here. Secondly, the same argument is being made in the other argument. If the overwhelming amounts of jobs are degrading and involve unjust power relations, then we should be we are de facto skeptical about. Then work as an institution is something worth being skeptical about too. And obviously that might not be a solid enough basis for abolition, but I think it makes a strong case for more than reform. But more interestingly, though, is Danaher's section on opportunity cost arguments from the anti-work side of things. So the opportunity cost argument is merely saying that there are better uses of our time than work, and should be preferred over work to the extent that we can do them instead. Danaher goes through the motions again and revises the premise of this argument to a more charitable line of, if engaging in activity X prevents us from engaging in a more valuable activity, and if X is not necessary for some greater good, then X ought to be abolished. With work obviously being a thing, the work being X in this case. So there are intrinsic and instrumental reasons for a preference of leisure over work. The instrumental reasons being that play or leisure would bring out the best in us, and that work won't. And the intrinsic being that these things are more valuable to us than work is. Danaher points out that one benefit of non-working things is that they are less subject to market forces. Depending on context, I may or may not be sympathetic. But here's where things get interesting. Danaher actually lays out 3 possible critiques to this position, to the opportunity cost argument from other people. So he says, for example, the necessity argument. We do need work for some greater good. People wouldn't produce as much as we do today without work. So while non-work may be, on the whole, better, work is unfortunately necessary. The second is the idleness, or idle hands in my terms, objection. Without work, humans would be far less likely to do good in the world and are much more likely to do evil things. And finally, the efficiency objection. Markets force us to do things in an efficient way, and giving up work may mean that we have to give up that efficient way of dealing with the world. But the interesting part here, way too many interesting parts apparently for me, is that Danaher actually argues against all 3 of these points. So let's take a briefly look at his 3 responses. So he says for the first point, for the necessity objection, he says that this is a fair point, but it is worth noting that far fewer people are employed meeting basic human needs now than were 100 years ago. Why? Because technology has allowed us to automate most agricultural and manufacturing jobs. Machines can now be used to meet our basic needs. Maybe machines could take over all the socially valuable aspects of economic activity and free us up to live the ludic life one can always dream. To the idleness or idle hands objection, he says that it is difficult to determine what is so bad about so-called vice and idleness, but suppose we could determine this. In that case, I have no doubt that in the absence of work, many will succumb to vice, but I'm pretty sure they do in the presence of work anyway. I mean, look at your typical, TV show about work or how people talk about, there's actually statistics about what people do during work. If they're in an office job, surfing the web is very popular, especially social networks like Facebook and stuff like that. So anyway, he continues, it's not clear to me that these things will be any worse in a world without work. People have basic psychological needs, e.g. for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. That will drive them to do the things in the absence of economic reward. And then the third part, the part about markets, is that he agrees that markets can be efficient, though sometimes they aren't, obviously. But as pointed out above, it's not clear that humans need to be the ones working to meet market demands. Also, in calling for the abolition or diminution of work, it does not follow that one is calling for the reinstallation of centrally planned governments. So Danaher finds the opportunity cost for the abolition of work much more persuasive than the moral argument. Now, I'm not in total agreement with him, but I think he gives us good reasons to care about the issue of work and consider whether work is inherently a good thing. Even if work doesn't need to be abolished, or it doesn't need anything to be done by certain terminology standards, it's still something we, especially as anarchists or even non-anarchists, should be talking about and discussing. So my site, abolishwork.com, is dedicated to exploring the subject of work and those who are discontent with it in some way, from those who simply want to revise it a little to those who want to throw it away completely and try something new. And whether the revisionists are anarchists and the abolitionists are just sort of weird radical liberals or something, I'm open to having a lot of different content on the site. So if you're interested, I'm also interested in hearing a lot from the audience here about work and sort of their perspectives and where they're coming from. So I hope this presentation has raised a lot of interesting questions for you. And maybe if I'm lucky, I've convinced you the necessity to at least seriously consider how we look at work if I haven't made you want to decide to smash the whole thing to begin with. But if you're going to smash it, do it very leisurely, because haste makes waste. Yeah, so workers of the world, relax. So I was going to record the questions and answers. Is anyone uncomfortable with that? I just want to let everybody know. I know some people don't like that kind of stuff. Okay.
Audio record or write down?
What?
Audio record or write down?
Audio record, right here.
Okay.
I saw a lot of people leaving, so I hope I wasn't doing something wrong. Maybe I was talking too fast. I have a bad tendency to do that when I get nervous.
It's a little bit hard to hear, to stay focused over here because of the number of voices drifting in from outside. Yeah. That's not at all your fault.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Or, yeah.
Well, I guess, I don't think you touched on it, but the relationship between debt and work.
Yeah.
You could just broad brush that.
Sure. Let's just knock that out of the park. Easy.
It's kind of obvious, but
yeah, sure.
didn't address it. So.
Yeah, I definitely didn't touch on it as much as I maybe should have. So, debt is like a huge part of sort of our society, you know, whether it's college or whether it's cars or houses or whatever. You know, I mean, one way to reduce sort of the debts that we get ourselves involved in is to change the way that we relate to society, the way that we have our lifestyle. So, you know, I'd say that college definitely, this sort of cultural expectation that everyone should go to college, whether you actually need to or not, should change. I know that we're in a college, but I still kind of think that going to college is overrated. Not that it's completely unnecessary. I do think that there are some professions or skills that it might make sense in. On the other hand, the ability to access so much credit, while at the same time, not a lot of people actually being able to pay it back, you know, because students oftentimes, surprise, aren't very rich, you know, is causing this sort of bubble. And I don't know how much longer it's going to keep inflating and not just pop, and just the whole education system is going to look very different. So, yeah, it doesn't seem sustainable to me the way that education is set up, but I mean, that isn't my primary focus, and I'm not an economist, so I mean, like, I can only go so far with the argumentation. But yeah, it seems to me that, like, that's a very important issue for work. It's not something I've covered as much as I should, but my sort of main thing would be just change how the way you relate to society. It's difficult because car culture is such a big way of how we find ourselves, especially not necessarily always in cities, but at least like where I live in Worcester, it's difficult to get around if you don't have a car. I live on a side street, and the side street that I'm on, that's on another side street, is like a dirt road basically. So and it's a hill, so it's like it's awful to get anywhere without without a car, which I don't have. So yeah.
I understand like the simplify your life argument as like an individual choice to make to reduce debt, but it's not really completely people's choice. People have accidents. Like a friend of mine recently got a concussion. Yeah. And now she owes like $37,000.
Yeah, that's true too.
So she's in debt for $37,000.
Yeah.
And I recently had to go to the hospital and I'm in debt like $1,000.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I'm not going to claim I have sort of like the answer to people's individual debt issues. Like I'm like in debt for, honestly, in terms of college debt that people have. I know this is really small, but it's like, $6,000 or whatever. And I don't even know how to handle it without compromising sort of my beliefs and what I mean, you compromise your beliefs every day. It's a choice of how much you want to and how much you're willing to. I tried to do the whole part-time job, retail, do this and try to pay off a little bit of the debt and then still try to live my life, but didn't seem to really work for me. It doesn't mean it doesn't work for everybody, but I seem to have a hard time anyway doing it. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have a ready-made sort of answer for that. I mean, it's really hard. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Yeah.
In the anti-work world, how would people incentivize the so-called dirty jobs that no one has to do, but someone has to do?
Sure.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's always going to be people who are, I think they're sort of, I think what Danaher was talking about, that we always have sort of these intrinsic psychological needs for autonomy and sort of, I forget the other things he listed, but I would add to that a lot of us have these sort of, I wouldn't say needs, I don't think we're like inherently altruistic, but I think a lot of us feel like we should help other people out. I feel like building certain, I'm getting kind of abstract here, but I feel like building sort of more community-focused areas around sort of work helps make these dirty jobs less dirty for people individually. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so I don't know, like just more collectively organizing around these sort of dirty jobs, so you don't have the same two people doing the trash every week for their job, so it's horribly monotonous and, I also think that some of these dirty jobs could just be automated and you wouldn't have to worry about them as much, but that's a whole other thing. Anyone else have any questions or comments? I don't know where we're at. 5:34, so we got 11 minutes. So here's your chance to I don't know, say something. I had something, but nothing was going off. Light bulb in my head just went. Shh.
Do you know? Sorry, go ahead.
Yep.
Do you have an opinion on like Jacques Fresco, Venus Project, that kind of stuff?
You know, I'm really sort of suspicious of it. I'm not terribly well read on it, so I don't have any like conclusions. I think that there's way too many. So because I'm against central planning, and I think that there are way too many calculation and information problems involved with that sort of planned economy that I think they're interested in. That's the impression I get. Anyway, I could be mistaken, so someone call me out if I am. But I just don't think it's tenable. It doesn't sound workable. It doesn't sound workable to me. This is the problem with being anti-work. You can't say workable anymore. So that's why you shouldn't believe anything I say, because my position is made full of ludicrous statements. But yeah, no. So I'm like skeptical of it. I don't know enough to like have some sort of like they're full of shit. But it seems like they want to go full communism with technology, which I think in a certain sense could work. But I don't think that like computers can run everything. I think there are just some things that people are going to be able to do that computers can't do. So, but yeah, we're getting out of the range of my expertise. So hopefully I'm not talking out of my ass. Did somebody else have something? Yeah.
Why are you against basic income?
So the basic income, so as an anarchist, I don't trust the state to do something as basic as, let me think of something basic that the government has fucked up. I don't know.
Toilets?
Yeah, maybe. It hinges on what you term basic, I guess. But yeah, so I don't trust the government to run people's lives, let alone determine what their income should be for the rest of their lives and what they should hinge on. The welfare state is already so problematic. I understand that some people think, well, we're in a shitty welfare state, let's make it a little better by giving just everybody the same regardless of, I think it's regardless of circumstance. It depends on who you ask. They're different people. I do want to make a sort of an anarchist anti-work response to the basic income because I think it's a trap that's getting a lot of people sort of stuck in reform mode instead of like against the state. I think people are trusting the state way too much to make big decisions about other people's lives, and historically speaking, the state usually fucks that up. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess the answer is I just don't trust the state fundamentally to do that. I don't trust politicians with my livelihood. In general. So I don't know. I hope that was okay. Does anybody else have any? I'm very self-conscious. Yeah.
Does the anti-work movement have a goal of eliminating hierarchical class structures because people would just do as they please, but like would there still be like class?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. So it depends. A lot of the anti-work people are anarchists. I'm kind of weird that I'm sort of like I'm an anarchist, but I'm not against markets. Like I know a lot of anarchists are against markets, but like I'm not like, but I'm like a mutualist anarchist or individualist anarchist, like Benjamin Tucker, Pierre Joseph Proudhon. I don't know if anybody. I don't mean to like drop names or whatever, but just don't want people to think like, oh, I don't know, some other person. But yeah, it depends generally on like I'm very skeptical of hierarchy. So for me personally, like I can't speak for the movement. There's not really much of a movement. The domain name abolishwork.com isn't taken. And really, if you look up abolishing work, my website is now the second result after only existing for around a year. This is a very niche thing. So I don't know if it is really even appropriate to call it a movement. Maybe I'm just the movement leader at this point. If so, God help the movement.
Oh, okay.
What?
There's a crime thing too.
Yeah, there's Crime Think. Yeah, that's a good point. Crime Think has some good stuff. I didn't need to read their abolish work stuff actually. But anyway, so I'm deeply skeptical of hierarchy. I think generally it's kind of like I have the minarchist view on hierarchy. I think that basically at best it's a dangerous servant, and I think at worst it's something that should be just abolished or at least challenged. So yeah, at least from my perspective, hierarchy would largely be gone. I don't think it's necessary. I think there are way too many sort of rationality issues with it. A lot of the people up top face all these perverse incentive structures, and they don't have to actually bear the costs of their decisions. The people at the bottom do. So largely I'm against hierarchy. So yeah.
what do you mean by skeptical of hiring? Like, it doesn't exist at the moment?
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean epistemologically. I meant like morally and efficiently. I'm skeptical that hierarchy can work or be moral in some way because of the power differentials. I mean, pretty basic anarchist concerns. What are we looking at for time here?
5 minutes.
Okay, cool. 5-6 minutes. Does anybody else have anything else? I'm mentally I'm happy too, but my throat is like on fire right now. But you feel free to talk to me after this 6 minutes or whatever, or just after everything's done. I'm happy to talk. I'll be here tomorrow as well at the ALL table, which again is right next to the information table. So I'm very conveniently located.
Why do you have a personal interest in anti-work?
Okay, well that's actually a very good question. So, I got into anti-work not because I read anything in particular. Actually, I was already an anarchist at the time, but I was working at Walgreens, and it just occurred to me how much I really disliked all the jobs I'd had, and how much in general I just really disliked the sort of structures that I was in. And I'd already kind of heard generally about anti-work, but I hadn't read anything really. I hadn't read Bob Black or all these people. And, it just kind of occurred to me that the way that we see work seems to be very different from the way that I experience it. And when I use we, I'm using the royal collective we, the society or whatever, So yeah, it wasn't some sort of anarchist manifesto. I just kind of realized while I was working at really shitty job that I really hated the jobs that I'd had, and I thought that most of the jobs honestly seemed pretty similar in my infinitesimal experience. So yeah, it was more based on personal experience than any anarchist manifesto. But I mean, since then I've read a lot about work. So I'd just rather people not have to have these really awful jobs that they hate. There's this sort of weird, perverse thing where people will actually start enjoying them, and they'll start I had this one experience. I worked in a department store called Kohl's, and there was one morning. There's this mall in Medford. It's called the Meadow Glen Mall or whatever. And if anyone's ever been there, it's a really awful mall. It's very depressing. Most of the stores are gone. It's one of those dying malls. That's in total denial, of course. Kohl's is like one of the biggest stores left. And so of course management's full denial, no one's saying anything, blah blah blah. And I was doing my usual thing. I was folding clothing, I wasn't really folding it, but I was making it look like I was folding it, which was really the important thing. The customers don't care. They wreck all the clothing anyway. Anyway, one of my coworkers comes over to me and says, "Oh, what are you doing? Why aren't you folding? You gotta fold it like this, and you gotta make it look very presentable to the customers." In my head, I'm like, what sort of fantasy land do you live in? This store is a mess. The mall is awful. This store almost 24/7 looks like a tornado hit it. The staff were understaffed. The management is awful. Most of them anyway. A few of them were okay, but by and large they were awful. The pay is shit, obviously. The working conditions not very good. So it's not just that bosses are capable of magical thinking. It's some of the employers also become engrossed in their job because it's part of their identity. The fact that their job is bad can't be true because that would mean that they're bad or something. So yeah, it's a sort of weird subsummation of people's identities and roles in their job. It's the same thing that people do with the nation state. It's very similar, and that's another reason why I think anarchists in particular, or just anybody who's critical of nation states, should be criticizing work, because the way people subsume their individuality to jobs is very frightening to me, especially as an individualist anarchist. So I'm paranoid about time. Okay, so we got 2 minutes. Does anybody have anything else? We can wrap up here. Yeah.
I had a comment on the last thing you said about folding clothes, they're not really doing it.
Yeah.
Is this idea of acceleration being a huge issue of in work, especially in late capitalist work and stuff like that, and that like introducing slowness
Yeah.
into the workplace is like a really great form
Yeah.
of revolution.
Yeah. I think like I didn't talk about this too much, but I do think personal change can be very good. I think things like this is very basic. I'm not saying like doing any of the following will start some sort of revolution or whatever, but just for your own personal health. I think things like meditation and just taking it easy, going for a walk, lying on a park bench or whatever. There's this great magazine in Britain called The Idler by Thomas Hodgkinson. And he has this great book. Well, okay, I can't say it's a great book because I haven't read it. But it's a book, and it looks great. It sounds great. But called How to Be Idle. And I really want to read it. It sounds really great. But he gives a lot of advice sort of on, how to live an easier and slower life. I definitely think doing that can make your life a lot more relaxing. So I think we're about out of time. I'm squeezing out the Q&As too much. So thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate everybody doing stuff. Yay.